At dinner, my husband's ex looked at him and said, "I can give you a baby if you want, because your wife isn't capable of it." He turned to me expecting silence. Instead, I smiled and whispered, "Follow your heart." The next morning I called my lawyer. But what happened after that, no one saw coming. The words came out of Brooklyn's mouth so casually, like she was offering to loan us her car instead of proposing to destroy my marriage. "I can give you a baby if you want because your wife isn't capable of it." She said it while looking at Miles with theatrical sympathy, her hand reaching across my dinner table to touch his arm. I had cooked for 3 hours. I had set out our wedding china. I had opened the expensive wine and told myself I was being mature by hosting my husband's ex-girlfriend, proving we were secure enough to welcome his past without threat. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here to witness stories of strength and self-preservation. If you believe that women deserve dignity and respect in their own homes, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach others who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. I was wrong. This was not about security. This was an ambush, carefully planned and perfectly executed, and I had provided the venue. Miles did not defend me. That was the detail that changed everything. He did not immediately shut her down or tell her how inappropriate she was being. Instead, he turned to look at me with an expression I could not read, something between curiosity and expectation, waiting to see how I would respond to being humiliated in my own home. In that frozen moment, every excuse I had made for his behavior over the past 6 months collapsed. The late nights at work. The secretive phone calls. The way he had become animated and engaged whenever Brooklyn's name came up in conversation. This was not innocent friendship. This was betrayal that had been building for months, and I had been too trusting or too afraid to acknowledge it until Brooklyn forced me to see it. I smiled at my husband and said 3 words that would end our marriage. "Follow your heart." He thought I was giving him permission. What I was actually giving him was enough rope to hang himself with, and a front row seat to watch me take everything he thought was his. But to understand how I ended up at that dinner table hosting my own humiliation with wine and good china, I need to go back 6 months. Back to when I still believed Miles and I had built something that could survive anything. Back to when I was still naive enough to think 14 years of marriage meant something more than just shared history and joint bank accounts. Our life had looked perfect from every angle that mattered to other people. We owned a Victorian home in Portland that we had renovated ourselves, spending weekends stripping wallpaper and arguing good-naturedly about paint colors. Miles worked in corporate finance, steadily climbing toward partner. I managed client relations for a marketing firm, work that paid well and gave me genuine satisfaction. We had routines that functioned smoothly. He went to the gym before work. I took long walks on Sunday mornings. We alternated cooking dinner and watched documentaries together in the evenings. Friends told us regularly how solid we seemed, how rare it was to find a couple who had made it past the difficult years and come out stronger on the other side. What those friends did not see was how much of that solidity was actually just silence. How many conversations we had stopped having because it was easier to discuss logistics than feelings. How our physical intimacy had become scheduled and obligatory rather than spontaneous and desired. How we had learned to exist in the same space without really connecting, 2 people performing the role of married couple without examining whether the marriage itself still had any substance beneath the performance. The cracks had started 3 years into our marriage when I was diagnosed with severe endometriosis. I remembered sitting in the doctor's office holding Miles's hand while she explained our limited options with clinical sympathy. The treatments were aggressive and offered no guarantees. Miles squeezed my fingers and said we would figure it out together, that children were not the only path to a meaningful life. I believed him because I desperately needed to believe him. We tried fertility treatments for 18 brutal months. Procedures that left me hormonal and exhausted, that turned my body into a science experiment that kept failing. After the 4th unsuccessful attempt, we sat in the clinic parking lot and agreed to stop trying. Miles said he would rather have me healthy and present than keep chasing something that might never happen. He said it with such conviction that I felt grateful rather than guilty, relieved rather than inadequate. We went home that day and opened a bottle of wine and talked about all the things we could do without children. Travel. Career advancement. Freedom to make spontaneous decisions without considering school schedules or childcare. For a while it worked. We redirected our energy into renovating our home, into weekend trips to Seattle and Vancouver, into hosting dinner parties where we served elaborate meals and told stories that made people laugh. We became the couple who proved you did not need children to have a fulfilling marriage. But underneath the surface adaptation, something fundamental had shifted. The loss we had experienced together had somehow pushed us apart rather than bringing us closer. Miles grew quieter, more distant, spending longer hours at work and less time engaged in conversations that went beyond surface planning. I threw myself into my career and my friendships, filling the spaces where intimacy used to exist with activity and accomplishment. I told myself this was normal. This was what long-term marriage looked like after the initial passion faded into something more mature and stable. We still cared about each other. We still functioned as effective partners. The love had just evolved into something quieter and less intense. I convinced myself that stability was not just enough but actually preferable to the exhausting intensity of early relationship years. Then Brooklyn Vale walked back into Miles's life and shattered every comfortable lie I had been telling myself. He mentioned her casually one evening in March, 6 months before the dinner that would end everything. He said he had run into an old friend at a gallery opening, someone he had dated in college before we met. Brooklyn had moved back to Portland after years working abroad and was consulting for various firms around the city. They had grabbed coffee to catch up on old times. He said it so casually, with such apparent innocence, that I barely registered concern. I asked if I knew her from college and Miles said probably not, that they had broken up before he and I met through mutual friends senior year. He described her as passionate but unstable, someone who made dramatic decisions and expected everyone else to accommodate her chaos. I should have paid closer attention to how much detail he volunteered without being asked. Over the following weeks, Brooklyn's name started appearing in our conversations with increasing frequency. She had recommended a new restaurant downtown that we should try. She was consulting on a project at Miles's firm and had interesting perspectives on workplace dynamics. She remembered funny stories from their college days that made him laugh in ways I had not heard in years. Each individual mention seemed insignificant, but collectively they formed a pattern I was working very hard not to see. Miles started checking his phone more often during dinner, smiling at messages he did not share. He began suggesting we skip our usual weekend routines so he could catch up on work, though I noticed his laptop rarely seemed open when I checked on him. He bought new clothes, started going to the gym more frequently, paid more attention to his appearance in ways he had not bothered with in years. He became animated when talking about his days, but the animation faded when he was actually home with me, as if he was saving his energy and engagement for someone else. I noticed all of it. I noticed and I explained it away because acknowledging what I was seeing would have required asking questions I was terrified to hear answered. I told myself he was just going through some kind of personal renewal, that it was healthy for him to have friendships outside our marriage. I pushed down the discomfort because I had spent so many years building the narrative of our solid, mature relationship that admitting something was wrong felt like admitting failure. Then Miles suggested we host Brooklyn for dinner, and I ran out of excuses to avoid facing reality. He presented it as a sign of confidence and maturity, proof that we were secure enough in our relationship to welcome his past without feeling threatened. He said Brooklyn had mentioned wanting to meet me, that she felt awkward about reconnecting with him without getting to know his wife. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like something a healthy, well-adjusted couple would do without hesitation. So I agreed, even as something deep in my stomach twisted with warning I refused to acknowledge. I spent 2 days preparing for that dinner. I selected wine from a vineyard we had visited on our anniversary. I cooked dishes I had perfected over years of hosting, recipes I knew would impress anyone with functioning taste buds. I set the table with our wedding china, the expensive set my mother had given us that we only used for truly special occasions. I told myself I was being welcoming and gracious, that this dinner was my opportunity to establish my place in Miles's life, to show Brooklyn that I was the woman who had built a real, lasting partnership with him while she was off chasing romantic fantasies in foreign countries. I chose my outfit carefully that September evening, wanting to project confidence and ease, wanting to seem completely unbothered by the presence of my husband's ex-girlfriend in our home. As I arranged fresh flowers in a vase and checked the roast one final time, I actually believed I was demonstrating emotional maturity and strength. I thought I was rising above petty jealousy and insecurity. I had no idea I was setting the stage for my own public humiliation, arranging the flowers and lighting the candles for a performance where I would play the role of fool. Brooklyn arrived exactly on time. I heard her voice before I saw her, warm and familiar with Miles in a way that told me they had been talking regularly enough to develop new rhythms of conversation, new inside references I was not part of. Miles opened the door and she stepped inside wearing a silk dress that looked painted onto her body, carrying expensive wine and confidence that seemed to expand and fill our entire home the moment she crossed the threshold. Miles hugged her and the embrace lasted several seconds too long, his hand settling on the small of her back with casual intimacy that made my throat tighten even as I told myself I was overreacting. She turned to me with a smile that looked practiced rather than genuine. "You must be Lila. I've heard so much about you." I shook her hand, noted that her grip was firm and her eye contact just slightly too intense, and welcomed her into my home with warmth I absolutely did not feel. And then the performance began. The long, slow march toward the moment when Brooklyn would stop pretending and Miles would reveal exactly who he had become when I was not paying close enough attention. The first course had gone exactly as I feared it would. Brooklyn dominated every conversation, her laughter too loud, her touches on Miles's arm too frequent, her references to their shared past too intimate. I smiled and nodded and refilled wine glasses while watching my husband transform into someone I barely recognized. He was animated in ways I had not seen in years, finishing her sentences, laughing at inside jokes I was not part of, his whole body turned toward her as if I had ceased to exist at my own dinner table. By the time I cleared the salad plates and brought out the main course, I had already started to understand that this dinner was not what Miles had presented it as. This was not a casual reunion between old friends. This was something else entirely. Something that had been building while I remained willfully blind to every warning sign. We had just finished the main course when Brooklyn set down her fork with deliberate precision. The gesture felt choreographed, like she had been waiting for exactly the right moment to deliver whatever she had come here to say. The temperature in the room shifted. I felt it before she even opened her mouth, the way the air changes before a storm breaks. She looked at Miles with theatrical sympathy, her head tilting slightly to the side in a gesture that was probably meant to appear compassionate but instead looked calculated and cruel. She said she had been thinking about something Miles had mentioned to her privately, something about his desire for children. My hands froze on my wine glass. The world seemed to narrow to just that sentence, those specific words that told me my husband had been discussing our most intimate pain with his ex-girlfriend, sharing feelings he had stopped sharing with me years ago. We had not talked about children in any meaningful way since we stopped treatments. After the final failed attempt, we had sat in that clinic parking lot and agreed to move forward, to accept our reality and build a different kind of life together. Miles had said he was at peace with it, that he would rather have me healthy than keep chasing something that might never happen. I had believed him. I had trusted that we were grieving together and then healing together, that our decision to stop trying was mutual and final. But apparently, Miles had been having very different conversations with Brooklyn. Conversations about desires he supposedly no longer had. Conversations about a future that apparently did not include me except as an obstacle to be worked around. Brooklyn's voice dropped to an intimate register that excluded me even while she was speaking directly about me. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, like she was sharing a secret with Miles that just happened to concern his wife. She told him she had been thinking about his situation, about what he was missing, about what she might be able to offer that I could not. Then she said the words that would end my marriage. She told Miles she could give him a baby if he wanted because I was not capable of it. She said it with practiced casualness, as if she were offering to loan him a book or recommend a restaurant rather than proposing to destroy everything I had built over 14 years. Her hand reached across the table to touch his arm, a gesture of comfort and intimacy that made my stomach turn. The silence that followed felt like drowning in ice water. Every sound in the room disappeared except for my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Time seemed to stretch and distort, seconds becoming hours while I waited for Miles to react. I waited for him to shut her down immediately, to tell her how inappropriate and cruel she was being, to defend me against this grotesque proposition delivered at our dinner table. He did not. Instead, Miles turned to look at me with an expression I could not read, something between curiosity and expectation. He was waiting to see how I would respond to being publicly humiliated in my own home. Waiting to gauge whether I would make a scene or swallow this latest indignity the way I had apparently been swallowing smaller ones for months without realizing it. In that frozen moment, every excuse I had made for his behavior over the past 6 months collapsed. The late nights at work that I had accepted without question. The secretive phone calls he had taken in other rooms. The way he checked his messages constantly and smiled at his screen in ways he had not smiled at me in years. The new clothes and increased attention to his appearance. The animation that appeared when Brooklyn's name came up in conversation and disappeared the moment we were alone together. This was not innocent friendship. This was not harmless nostalgia between old flames who had moved on with their lives. This was betrayal that had been building systematically for months, and I had been too trusting or too afraid or too invested in maintaining the illusion of our perfect marriage to acknowledge what was happening right in front of me. Brooklyn was still touching Miles's arm, her fingers resting on his wrist like she had every right to that casual intimacy. She was watching me with barely concealed satisfaction, waiting for the emotional explosion she had clearly orchestrated. She wanted tears. She wanted anger. She wanted me to provide dramatic confirmation that I was the inadequate wife she had painted me as, the woman who could not give Miles what he deserved and was now standing in the way of his happiness. Every possible response flashed through my mind in rapid succession. I could throw my wine in her smug face and watch the expensive Cabernet stain that silk dress. I could demand she leave my home immediately and never contact my husband again. I could scream at Miles for his complicity in this calculated humiliation, for discussing our private pain with the woman who was now weaponizing it against me. But something else took over in that moment, something colder and more calculating than raw emotion. I looked at Brooklyn's satisfied smirk, at the way she was still touching my husband's arm, at Miles's uncertain face as he waited for my reaction. And I understood with perfect clarity that losing control right now would give them exactly what they wanted. It would confirm Brooklyn's narrative that I was the problem, the emotional and inadequate wife who could not handle reality. It would give Miles justification for whatever he was planning to do next, permission to rewrite our entire marriage history with me as the villain who drove him away. So instead of giving them the scene they expected, I made a choice that would define everything that followed. I smiled. Not a warm smile or a forgiving smile, but the kind of smile that comes from a place beyond rage, from somewhere cold and strategic that I did not know existed inside me until that exact moment. I looked directly at my husband, holding his gaze with perfect composure, and delivered my response with calm that felt almost inhuman. I told Miles to follow his heart. My voice was steady and quiet, each word carefully chosen and deliberately spoken. The phrase hung in the air between us, and I watched Brooklyn's expression shift from satisfaction to confusion. She had expected tears or anger or some kind of emotional collapse. Instead, I had given her nothing to work with, no drama to feed off, no confirmation that her cruelty had landed the way she intended. Miles looked almost relieved, and that reaction told me everything I needed to know about how far gone he already was. He interpreted my composure as consent rather than strategy, my calm as acceptance rather than declaration of war. He thought I was giving him permission to pursue whatever fantasy he and Brooklyn had been building together during those secret coffee meetings and private conversations. But they were both wrong about what those 3 words actually meant. I was not giving Miles permission. I was giving him enough rope to hang himself with. I was documenting his choice in real time, creating a witness to his failure to defend me, setting in motion a plan that neither of them would see coming until it was far too late to stop. They thought they were winning. They had no idea I had just declared war, and that by the time they realized what was happening, I would have already taken everything that mattered. Brooklyn finally removed her hand from Miles's arm, looking uncertain for the first time that evening. She tried to recapture her earlier confidence, suggesting we move to the living room for dessert and coffee, as if we were all just going to continue the evening like nothing significant had happened. Miles started to stand still, watching me with that mixture of relief and confusion. I excused myself from the table with perfect grace, citing a headache that was only partially fabricated. My head was pounding, but not from pain. From rage and clarity and the beginning of a plan that was forming with crystalline precision in my mind. I told them to please enjoy dessert without me, that I just needed to lie down for a few minutes in the quiet. Miles started to protest, perhaps recognizing that he should at least pretend to be concerned about my sudden departure. But Brooklyn touched his arm again, her voice low and soothing, telling him to let me rest, that I probably just needed space to process. The presumption in her tone, the way she was already making decisions about what I needed in my own home, made my jaw clench so hard I thought my teeth might crack. I walked upstairs with measured steps, not allowing myself to rush even though every instinct screamed to run. I heard their voices resume below, lower now, conspiratorial. They were probably discussing my reaction, analyzing whether I had truly accepted Brooklyn's proposition or if this was just the calm before some delayed storm. They would find out soon enough exactly what kind of storm was coming. I closed the bedroom door behind me and locked it with hands that had finally started to shake. The composure I had maintained downstairs was cracking now that I was alone, adrenaline flooding my system in waves that made my legs unsteady. I sat on the edge of our bed in the darkness, listening to the muffled sound of voices drifting up from the dining room. Miles and Brooklyn were still talking, their conversation punctuated by her laughter, the sound grating against my nerves like nails on glass. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the contacts. What I was about to do would change everything. There would be no going back from this decision, no possibility of reconciliation or working things out. But then I thought about the way Miles had looked at me when Brooklyn made her grotesque proposition, that expression of curiosity rather than outrage, and my thumb moved with sudden certainty. Patricia Holland answered on the third ring despite the late hour. Her voice was alert and professional, the tone of someone accustomed to calls that came when lives were falling apart. I explained the situation in clinical detail, keeping my voice low and steady even as tears ran silently down my face. I told her about the dinner, about Brooklyn's calculated cruelty, about Miles's failure to defend me. I described the text messages I had seen over the past months, the ones I had dismissed as innocent but now understood were building blocks of betrayal. Patricia listened without interruption, and when I finished there was a pause that felt heavy with assessment. Then she asked if I understood what I was actually requesting, that this was not just divorce preparation but a comprehensive legal strategy designed to protect my interests while exposing his vulnerabilities. She used the phrase scorched earth, and something about hearing it stated so plainly made the reality of what I was doing crystallize in my mind. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window across from the bed. The woman staring back at me looked unfamiliar, her face composed but her eyes hard with determination I had never seen before. I thought about all the years I had spent accommodating Miles, making myself smaller to fit into his vision of partnership, swallowing disappointments and redirecting my own desires to maintain the illusion of our perfect marriage. That woman was gone, burned away by the humiliation I had just endured at my own dinner table. I told Patricia yes, that was exactly what I wanted. We scheduled an emergency meeting for Monday morning, and she instructed me to act completely normal over the weekend, to give Miles no indication that anything had changed. She told me to document everything, to photograph any evidence I could access, to begin securing assets that were legally mine. Her voice was calm and methodical, walking me through steps that felt surreal even as I committed to taking them. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness for several more minutes, letting my breathing slow and my hands steady. Then I began the work Patricia had outlined. I opened old text message threads between Miles and Brooklyn, screenshotting conversations I had previously dismissed as harmless. Exchanges about meeting for coffee that I now recognized as deliberate concealment. References to inside jokes and shared memories that excluded me. Complaints about our marriage that Miles had apparently been sharing with her for months while telling me everything was fine. Each screenshot felt like documentation of my own blindness, evidence of how thoroughly I had been deceived while choosing to see only what I wanted to see. I photographed the jewelry box where I kept receipts for major purchases, proof of my financial contributions to our life together. I opened our joint bank accounts and took screenshots of balances and transaction histories, creating a record that would establish my claim to assets we had supposedly built together. Downstairs, I heard the front door open and Brooklyn's voice saying goodbye, followed by the sound of Miles walking her out. I moved quickly to the window and watched them in the driveway, their bodies lit by the porch light I had turned on hours ago when I still believed this dinner was about maturity rather than ambush. Miles had his hand on the small of Brooklyn's back again, that gesture of casual intimacy that would have destroyed me earlier in the evening. Now it just felt like evidence, one more piece of documentation for the case Patricia would build. Brooklyn turned to face Miles before getting into her car, and I watched her touch his chest, her hand lingering there while they talked. The body language was unmistakable, the familiarity of two people who had been spending far more time together than Miles had ever admitted. I memorized every detail, the way he leaned toward her, the smile on his face that looked nothing like the careful expressions he wore around me lately, the reluctance with which they finally separated. When Miles came back inside, I was downstairs loading the dishwasher as if nothing significant had happened. I heard him pause in the doorway, probably trying to read my mood, to understand why I was not crying or confronting him or providing any of the dramatic reactions he had likely been bracing for. I kept my back to him, rinsing plates with steady hands, playing the role of the accommodating wife one more time. He asked if I was okay, his voice tentative and confused. I turned and smiled at him, the same kind of calm smile I had given him at the dinner table. I told him I was fine, just tired from all the hosting and cooking. I suggested we watch a movie together, something light and mindless to unwind before bed. The relief that flooded his face was almost insulting, confirming that he had expected anger or tears, some dramatic confirmation that Brooklyn's cruelty had landed as intended. Instead, my composure had thrown him off balance, made him uncertain about what had actually transpired at that table. Good. I wanted him uncertain and confused. Uncertainty would make him careless, would keep him from recognizing the trap that was already closing around him. We watched half of some comedy neither of us was really paying attention to, Miles checking his phone periodically and smiling at messages I knew were from Brooklyn. I sat beside him on the couch where we had spent countless evenings over 14 years, and felt absolutely nothing except cold determination. When he reached over to hold my hand during a quiet moment in the film, I let him, my fingers interlacing with his while my mind catalogued assets and calculated timelines. Saturday morning I woke before dawn and lay in the darkness planning my day with military precision. Patricia had told me to act normal and I would give Miles the performance of a lifetime. When I finally got up, I went downstairs and started making his favorite breakfast, humming softly while I cooked his omelette exactly the way he preferred it. The domesticity of the scene felt like theater. Me playing the role of devoted wife while plotting the systematic dismantling of everything we had built together. Miles emerged from the bedroom looking surprised and pleased to find me cheerful and affectionate. I asked about his plans for the day as if the previous evening had been perfectly ordinary, as if his ex-girlfriend had not offered to bear his child at our dinner table. He said he was meeting friends at the gym and I encouraged him to take his time to enjoy his Saturday. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my purse and keys. The bank was my first stop. I opened a new account in my name only and transferred exactly half of our joint savings, an amount I could legally claim without triggering immediate fraud alerts. The representative asked routine questions about the transfer, and I explained smoothly that I was consolidating accounts for tax planning purposes. My voice was steady, my smile practiced, my entire demeanor that of someone making a mundane financial decision rather than preparing for war. Next I drove across town to a storage facility I had researched online that morning. I rented a unit paying cash for 3 months up front, using a facility far enough from our neighborhood that Miles would never accidentally discover it. The manager handed me keys and a lock and I drove back home with purpose hardening in my chest. For the next several hours while Miles was at the gym and then meeting friends for lunch, I methodically removed items from our house that were legally and emotionally mine. Family heirlooms my grandmother had left me in her will. Artwork I had purchased before our marriage with my own money. Jewelry that predated Miles. Photo albums from my childhood and college years that documented a life he had never been part of. Each item disappeared into boxes that I loaded into my car and transported to the storage unit. I felt no guilt as I emptied drawers and closets of things that belonged solely to me. Only cold satisfaction that I was protecting what was mine before Miles could claim any of it in divorce proceedings. By the time he returned home that afternoon, I had made 3 trips to storage and our house looked exactly the same to casual observation. But I knew what was missing, what I had secured beyond his reach, and the knowledge felt like power accumulating in my favor. Sunday passed in similar fashion. I maintained perfect normalcy, cooking meals and suggesting activities, playing the role of contented wife while internally counting down hours until Monday morning when everything would change. That evening Miles took a shower before bed, leaving his iPad on the nightstand. A message notification lit up the screen, and I saw Brooklyn's name before I could look away. I picked up the device with hands that had stopped shaking, my movements quick and efficient. The message was explicit in ways that made my stomach turn. Brooklyn referenced conversations about timelines and possibilities, about starting fresh with someone who wanted the same future. She mentioned a doctor's appointment she had already scheduled to discuss fertility options, asking if Miles wanted to come with her to the consultation. I photographed the message with my phone, fingers moving automatically through steps that were becoming routine, adding evidence to a collection that grew more damning with each piece. I heard the shower turn off and set the iPad back exactly where Miles had left it, then returned to my position in bed with my book open to the same page I had been pretending to read. Miles emerged from the bathroom and kissed my forehead, told me he loved me in a voice that sounded sincere enough to have fooled me days ago. I smiled and said it back, the words empty shells that meant nothing except strategic necessity. He climbed into bed beside me and fell asleep quickly, his breathing evening out into the rhythm I had listened to for 14 years. I lay awake in the darkness beside him, staring at the ceiling and wondering how many nights he had lain here planning his betrayal while I slept trustingly beside him. Monday morning arrived with sunshine so bright it felt like mockery. I woke before the alarm, my body already flooded with adrenaline that made sleep impossible. Miles was still breathing deeply beside me, oblivious to the fact that this was the last morning he would wake up in this bed, in this house, in this marriage. I slipped out quietly and went through my morning routine with mechanical precision, each movement deliberate and controlled. I dressed in my navy suit, the one tailored specifically for high-stakes client meetings, the one that made me look polished and unshakable. I applied makeup with more care than usual, wanting to project absolute confidence for what was coming. When I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked calm and professional, betraying none of the rage and hurt churning beneath the surface. Good. That was exactly the armor I needed today. Miles was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at the table with his coffee and his phone. He barely glanced up when I entered, his attention absorbed by whatever message he was reading. Probably Brooklyn, I thought, probably planning their future while sitting in the home I was about to reclaim. I told him I had an early appointment downtown, keeping my voice casual and light. He nodded absently and said something about having a busy day himself. I walked over and kissed him goodbye, a brief touch of lips that felt like closing a book I would never open again. He smiled at me, completely unaware that he would never see me look at him with anything resembling affection again. The drive to Patricia's office felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. The city was waking up around me, people heading to work and school, living their normal Monday mornings while my entire existence was about to transform. I parked in the garage beneath Patricia's building and took the elevator to the 12th floor, my heels clicking against the marble with each step. Patricia was waiting in her conference room with documents spread across the table like battle plans. She had worked through the weekend, she told me, ensuring every detail was perfect and every vulnerability in Miles's position was exposed. The divorce petition was comprehensive and devastating. It outlined the timeline of his emotional affair with Brooklyn, documented through the text messages and emails I had provided. It detailed the financial contributions I had made to our household, proving that the house had been purchased primarily with my inheritance and improved with bonuses from my career. It established my separate accounts and independent assets, painting a picture of financial autonomy that would be critical in asset division. But the true masterpiece was the restraining order Patricia had crafted. She explained that while emotional cruelty was harder to prove than physical violence, the circumstances of that dinner created a compelling case for intentional infliction of emotional harm. Brooklyn's proposition had been delivered in my own home at my own table, exploiting my known infertility in a calculated act of humiliation. Miles's failure to defend me or shut down the proposition immediately demonstrated his complicity. The text messages I had sent to my sister immediately after the dinner, describing my distress and shock, provided contemporaneous documentation of the harm inflicted. Patricia had also included evidence of the ongoing communication between Miles and Brooklyn, the planning and timeline discussions that proved this was not a spontaneous moment of poor judgment but part of a sustained betrayal. The restraining order would require Miles to vacate our home immediately and maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from me pending a formal hearing. It would prevent him from accessing the house, from contacting me directly, from controlling any part of the narrative about what was happening. I signed every document with a steady hand, my signature appearing again and again on papers that would dismantle 14 years of marriage in a matter of hours. Patricia watched me carefully, probably assessing whether I might break down or change my mind at this final moment. But I felt nothing except cold determination and relief that I was finally taking action instead of passively accepting betrayal. Patricia explained the timeline with military precision. The papers would be filed electronically by noon, ensuring they were officially on record before Miles even knew what was happening. A process server would deliver them to Miles at his office at 2:30 in the afternoon. The timing was deliberate. Serving him at work meant he would be surrounded by colleagues, unable to react with the anger or manipulation he might deploy in private. It meant he would have no opportunity to rush home and confront me before the restraining order was in effect. It meant the first thing he would experience was public humiliation, a small taste of what he had allowed Brooklyn to inflict on me. I left Patricia's office at 10 and drove to a coffee shop where I sat for hours, unable to focus on anything except watching the clock. At noon, Patricia texted me that the filing was complete. At 2:15 she confirmed the process server was in position. At 2:30 exactly my phone began to ring. Miles's name flashed on the screen again and again. I watched it buzz against the table, imagining his face as he read through the divorce petition and restraining order, his confusion turning to shock turning to panic as he realized what was happening. After the fifth call went to voicemail I blocked his number. Seconds later Brooklyn started calling. Her first voicemail was shrill with accusations about manipulation and cruelty, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested genuine panic. I blocked her number too and sat in the coffee shop feeling nothing except satisfaction that they were both finally experiencing consequences. Patricia called at 3 to tell me that Miles's attorney had already made contact, demanding explanations and threatening countermotions. She sounded almost amused as she described the other lawyer's obvious shock at the comprehensiveness of our filing. Apparently Miles had retained someone quickly, probably calling from his office in desperation, and the attorney had not yet had time to fully understand the strength of our position. Patricia assured me she would handle all communication and that I should go home, that the house was now legally and exclusively mine. I drove back slowly, taking streets I normally avoided, delaying the moment when I would walk into a home that was suddenly and completely transformed. When I finally pulled into the driveway I sat in the car for several minutes just looking at the house. It looked exactly the same from the outside, the Victorian facade I had loved for so many years still beautiful in the late afternoon light. But everything was different now. The locksmith had come that afternoon while I was at Patricia's office, a detail I had arranged over the weekend with careful planning. Every lock had been changed, every security code updated. I had also arranged for cameras to be installed at every entrance, discrete systems that would record any attempt Miles made to access the property. I walked through the front door with my new key and felt the difference immediately. The air seemed lighter somehow, the space more open, as if Miles's presence had been weighing everything down without me realizing it. In the garage I found the boxes I had packed Sunday night after Miles fell asleep. His clothes and personal items, his laptop and books, everything that was clearly and exclusively his, all neatly organized and stacked. I had left him everything he would need to set up a life somewhere else, but nothing that was mine or that we had built together with my money. The furniture stayed. The kitchen equipment stayed. The art and the books and the small objects that made this house a home, all of it stayed because all of it was mine. I walked through the rooms touching surfaces that felt different now, running my fingers along the back of the couch where Miles used to sit with his laptop, standing in the kitchen where Brooklyn had delivered her poisonous proposition just days ago. The memories were still there but they felt distant already, like they belonged to a different person in a different life. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at the window watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, and felt relief so profound it made me lightheaded. My phone buzzed constantly through the evening, messages coming from people I had not heard from in months or years. Miles's mother called crying, leaving a voicemail about how I was destroying her son over a misunderstanding. His best friend Jake texted asking if we could talk like adults, suggesting I was overreacting to a difficult situation. His sister sent a long message about forgiveness and second chances and not throwing away 14 years of marriage in a moment of anger. None of them knew the full truth. None of them had seen the text messages between Miles and Brooklyn or understood how long this betrayal had been building. They only knew Miles's version of events, whatever story he was telling to position himself as the confused victim of my sudden irrational vindictiveness. I responded to none of them. Instead, I forwarded the most persistent messages to Patricia and let her handle the documentation of Miles's attempts to control the narrative through proxy. By midnight, I had received messages from 17 different people, all variations on the same theme of how I should be more understanding, more forgiving, more willing to work things through instead of taking such dramatic action. But not one of them asked what had actually happened at that dinner. Not one of them questioned why Miles had failed to defend me when Brooklyn humiliated me about my infertility. Not one of them seemed to consider that maybe, just maybe, I had very good reasons for the choices I was making. I turned off my phone and went upstairs to the bedroom that was now entirely mine. I slept deeply that first night alone in the house, a dreamless sleep that felt like my body finally releasing tension it had been holding for months. When I woke Tuesday morning, the silence felt different than it ever had before. Not lonely or unsettling, but peaceful in a way that made me realize how much ambient stress had been filling this space without me consciously recognizing it. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table watching morning light filter through the windows, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt no pressure to be anywhere or perform any particular version of myself for anyone else's benefit. That fragile peace lasted exactly 3 hours. The doorbell rang just after 10, insistent and repeated in a way that suggested whoever was there had no intention of leaving. I checked the camera feed on my phone and saw my younger sister Carmen standing on the porch, shifting her weight from foot to foot in obvious agitation. I had not told her about filing for divorce yet, only about the dinner itself through the text messages I had sent in real time that night. Those messages had become part of Patricia's evidence, documentation of my immediate distress that helped establish the emotional harm Brooklyn had inflicted. I opened the door and Carmen practically pushed past me into the house, her face pale and her hands clutching her phone like it contained evidence of some crime. She said she needed to tell me something she had been keeping from me, something she should have told me weeks ago but had not known how to handle. The words came out in a rush, tangled with apologies and justifications, and I had to ask her to slow down and start from the beginning. 6 weeks ago, Carmen said she had been downtown meeting a friend for lunch when she saw Miles and Brooklyn sitting together at a coffee shop. She had noticed them through the window while walking past, and something about their body language had made her pause. They were sitting too close, leaning toward each other across the small table in a way that suggested intimacy rather than casual friendship. Brooklyn had been laughing at something Miles said, her hand resting on his arm, and Miles had that animated expression I had noticed appearing more frequently when he talked about his days away from home. Carmen said she had assumed it was innocent at the time, that I must know about it, that Miles was probably just catching up with an old friend the way he had described when Brooklyn first reappeared in his life. But looking back now with the context of what had happened at dinner, she realized their interaction had not looked like old friends reconnecting. It had looked like two people in the early stages of an affair, testing boundaries and building intimacy while pretending it was all perfectly innocent. Then 2 weeks ago Carmen had seen them again. This time at a restaurant across town, a place nice enough that it suggested intentional planning rather than spontaneous meeting. She had been there for a work dinner when she spotted them at a table in the corner, and what she saw made her uncomfortable enough that she pulled out her phone and took a photo without really thinking through why. Brooklyn had her hand on Miles's face in a gesture of such tenderness that it was unmistakably romantic. Miles was looking at her with an expression Carmen had rarely seen him wear around me, unguarded and completely present in a way that spoke to genuine emotional connection. Carmen showed me the photo now, her hands shaking as she apologized for not telling me sooner. She said she had not known what to do with the information, had convinced herself she was misreading the situation, had been too afraid of causing problems in my marriage if she was wrong. But after I sent her those text messages about the dinner, about Brooklyn's proposition and Miles's failure to defend me, she realized she had been watching my husband build a relationship with another woman while I remained completely unaware. I looked at the photo on her phone and felt something crack open inside me that I had been holding carefully closed since Monday. It was one thing to see text messages, to read evidence of betrayal in words exchanged privately. It was another thing entirely to see visual proof of intimacy, to witness the physical manifestation of emotional affair in a photograph that captured a moment of tenderness that should have been reserved for me. Brooklyn's fingers were curved against Miles's jaw, her thumb brushing his cheek, and he was leaning into her touch like it was something familiar and welcome. Carmen was crying now, repeating that she should have told me immediately, that she should have confronted Miles or warned me or done something other than keep silent while my marriage deteriorated. I told her it would not have changed anything, that I had not been ready to see the truth until Brooklyn forced me to see it at that dinner table. Even if Carmen had shown me this photo weeks ago, I probably would have found some way to explain it away, to convince myself it was innocent because accepting the reality of Miles's betrayal would have required taking action I was not yet prepared to take. But the photo was useful now, concrete visual evidence that would strengthen the case Patricia was building. I forwarded it to my lawyer with a brief explanation and watched Carmen's guilt transform into something like relief that at least her silence could be partially redeemed by contributing to my legal strategy. Carmen left an hour later, still apologizing, and I assured her I understood and held no anger toward her for the position she had been put in. After she drove away, I stood at the window where I had watched Miles walk Brooklyn to her car Friday night and wondered how many other people had witnessed pieces of this betrayal without knowing what to do with the information they had. The answer came Tuesday afternoon when Miles's parents showed up at my door. I saw them through the camera feed before they even rang the bell. Robert and Diane getting out of their car with expressions of determination that told me this was not going to be a pleasant conversation. I considered not answering, but avoiding them would only delay what was clearly inevitable. I opened the door but did not invite them inside, standing on the threshold in a physical manifestation of the boundary I was establishing. Robert demanded to know what was happening, his voice already raised in a way that suggested he had come prepared for confrontation rather than conversation. Diane was crying before she even started speaking, asking how I could do this to their son, how I could destroy a marriage over what she insisted was a misunderstanding. She said I was being cruel and vindictive, punishing Miles for wanting a family, throwing his struggles with infertility in his face when it was not his fault. The comment was so disconnected from reality that I actually laughed, a short sharp sound that made both of them step back slightly. I corrected her calmly, explaining that I was the one with endometriosis. I was the one whose body could not support pregnancy. I was the one who had undergone surgeries and treatments and monthly disappointments. Miles had been supportive through all of that, yes, but he was not the one whose medical condition was being weaponized by his ex-girlfriend at dinner parties. Robert interrupted to demand proof that anything inappropriate had actually happened between Miles and Brooklyn. His voice was loud enough that I glanced around to see if neighbors were watching, and I made the split-second decision to show them exactly what their son had been doing behind my back. I pulled out my phone and showed them screenshots of text messages between Miles and Brooklyn, conversations about starting fresh and building a future together and having the children Miles apparently still desperately wanted despite telling me he had made peace with our childless life. Robert's face went white as he read through the messages. Diane made a small wounded sound and her crying intensified, but this time it seemed directed at shock and disappointment rather than defense of her son. They stood there on my porch for a long moment, both of them clearly struggling to reconcile the evidence I had shown them with whatever version of events Miles had fed them. They left without another word, walking back to their car with the defeated posture of people who had come prepared to fight and instead found themselves confronted with undeniable truth. That evening, Diane called my phone. I let it ring twice before answering, her voice small and broken on the other end. She apologized for what she had said earlier, admitted she had no idea things had gone as far as the messages indicated. She said she had thought Brooklyn was just causing trouble the way she always had, stirring up drama and inserting herself where she was not wanted. But the text messages made it clear this was not one-sided manipulation. Miles had been an active and willing participant in building something with Brooklyn while still married to me. I accepted her apology without offering forgiveness, keeping my voice neutral and detached. I suggested she direct her disappointment and concern at her son rather than at me, that I was not responsible for managing her emotional response to his choices. We ended the call politely but without warmth, and I knew that whatever relationship I might have maintained with Miles's family was now permanently severed. Work became its own complication by Wednesday. Miles and I had always worked in adjacent industries, close enough that we shared some professional circles and attended some of the same networking events. Word of our separation spread faster than I had anticipated, probably helped along by Miles sharing his version of events with anyone who would listen. My colleague Dennis pulled me aside in the break room Wednesday afternoon, his expression uncomfortable as he said he had heard Miles and I were having problems. He hoped we could work things out, he said. That divorce seemed like an extreme response to what was probably just a rough patch that all long marriages went through eventually. I looked at him directly and asked if he knew Miles had been having an emotional affair. Dennis went pale and started stammering that Miles had mentioned reconnecting with an old friend but had never said anything that sounded inappropriate. I realized then that Miles had been carefully crafting his narrative for weeks, telling colleagues just enough to establish plausible deniability while systematically building a relationship with Brooklyn that he knew crossed every boundary of appropriate behavior. Other colleagues became either overly solicitous or obviously distant, their sympathy thinly veiling curiosity about the scandal unfolding in their midst. I started eating lunch at my desk to avoid the break room conversations, keeping my office door closed more often than I ever had before, and responding to collegial small talk with polite brevity that discouraged further inquiry. The professional life I had built carefully over years suddenly felt contaminated by my personal crisis. Every interaction colored by the knowledge that people were talking about me when I was not present, crafting narratives about my marriage and my choices based on incomplete information and whatever version of events Miles was distributing through his own network of contacts. The strain of maintaining professional composure while my private life was being publicly dissected took its toll in ways I had not anticipated. I found myself exhausted by early afternoon, drained not by the actual work but by the constant performance of normalcy. By Thursday evening, I was grateful when Patricia called to schedule our preparation session for the restraining order hearing, giving me something concrete to focus on besides the gossip circulating through my workplace. Friday morning I arrived at Patricia's office to find she had brought in a consultant, a therapist named Dr. Sarah Winters who specialized in emotional abuse cases. Patricia explained that Dr. Winters would help us frame my testimony in ways that would resonate with the judge, that would make clear the psychological harm inflicted by Brooklyn's proposition and Miles's failure to defend me. I had not thought of what happened at that dinner as abuse, had been focused primarily on the betrayal and humiliation aspects. But as Dr. Winters began asking questions, I started to understand how the therapeutic framework could strengthen our legal position. Dr. Winters asked me to describe the evolution of my marriage, not just the dramatic moments but the gradual changes that had occurred over months and years. She wanted to know when I had first noticed Miles becoming distant, when intimacy had shifted from spontaneous to obligatory, when conversations had narrowed from genuine connection to logistical coordination. I found myself describing patterns I had not consciously recognized until I was forced to articulate them aloud. Miles had stopped asking about my work sometime in the past year, I realized as I talked through our typical evenings. He used to ask detailed questions about my projects and clients, would remember names and follow up on situations I had mentioned days earlier. But gradually those questions had stopped, replaced by vague inquiries that required only minimal response. During dinner he had started scrolling through his phone more frequently, his attention divided in ways that made conversation feel like an interruption rather than a connection. When I tried to engage him in discussions about anything beyond household logistics, he would become irritable, picking fights over small things as if he was looking for reasons to be annoyed with me. Dr. Winters nodded as I described these changes, explaining that emotional affairs often followed this pattern. The unfaithful spouse begins rewriting the history of the marriage in their mind, retroactively casting their partner as inadequate to justify the attraction developing elsewhere. Small irritations get magnified into fundamental incompatibilities. Normal relationship challenges get reframed as evidence that the marriage was never really working. It was a psychological process that allowed the betraying partner to feel less guilty about their choices, to tell themselves they were not really doing anything wrong because the relationship was already broken. Hearing my marriage dissected this clinically was painful, each pattern Dr. Winters identified feeling like confirmation of failures I had been too close to see clearly. But it also gave me clarity and language for experiences I had dismissed as normal relationship evolution. I had told myself that marriages naturally grew quieter over time, that the intensity of early years faded into something more stable and less demanding. But what I had actually been experiencing was Miles systematically disconnecting from me emotionally while building connection with someone else. Patricia recorded our entire preparation session and had it transcribed, creating a document that would guide my testimony when I took the stand. She explained that under pressure in the courtroom with Miles sitting across from me and his attorney asking challenging questions, it would be easy to become flustered or forget important details. Having this structured narrative would help me stay focused and ensure I presented the story coherently and convincingly. We spent hours going through potential questions Miles's attorney might ask, practicing responses that were honest but strategic, that acknowledged complications without undermining my position. Dr. Winters coached me on maintaining composure if the questioning became aggressive or if attempts were made to paint me as vindictive or unstable. By the time I left Patricia's office late Friday afternoon, I felt as prepared as I could be, though the knot of anxiety in my stomach had not loosened. That weekend, Miles's attorney filed his counterpetition, and Patricia forwarded it to me Saturday morning with a brief note saying we needed to discuss it. I read through the legal document in my kitchen with coffee that went cold as I absorbed what they were attempting to argue. According to Miles's version of events, I had completely overreacted to a harmless dinner conversation, misinterpreting Brooklyn's compassionate offer to help us have children as some kind of calculated cruelty. The petition claimed that Miles had been shocked by my extreme response, that he had been trying to process Brooklyn's unexpected proposition when I had smiled and told him to follow his heart, which he had interpreted as my blessing to consider all options for our future. They were trying to reframe the entire evening, turning Brooklyn's deliberate humiliation of me into misunderstood generosity, turning Miles's failure to defend me into confusion rather than complicity. The petition included character references from Miles's colleagues describing him as a devoted husband who frequently spoke lovingly about his wife. It included testimony from his parents stating they had never witnessed any inappropriate behavior between Miles and Brooklyn, that their son had mentioned reconnecting with an old friend but nothing that suggested romantic interest. Reading their version of reality made my hands shake with rage so intense I had to set down the pages and walk away before I could finish. They were gaslighting me through legal documentation, attempting to make me question my own perceptions and reactions, suggesting I was either delusional or vindictive in my interpretation of events that had been crystal clear in their cruelty. The fact that Miles was willing to sign his name to this narrative, to officially claim that Brooklyn's offer had been compassionate rather than calculated, told me more about his character than 14 years of marriage ever had. I called Patricia and she talked me down from the rage spiraling through my chest. She explained that this was actually helpful for our case, that their decision to rely on gaslighting rather than evidence was a strategic mistake. We had text messages proving Miles and Brooklyn had been planning their future together for months. We had Carmen's photograph showing physical intimacy between them. We had Brooklyn's own social media posts suggesting she saw herself as the rightful partner Miles deserved. Miles's attorney had apparently underestimated both the documentation I had gathered and the judge's ability to see through obvious manipulation. Monday brought an unexpected development. I received a call from an unknown number late in the afternoon, and I answered it hesitantly, half expecting another attempt from Miles's family or friends to reach me. Instead, the woman on the other end identified herself as Vanessa Hartley, explaining that she had been Brooklyn's college roommate and had remained friends with her until about 2 years ago. She said she had heard about the situation through mutual connections, that news of the divorce and restraining order had spread through their extended social circle, and she needed to tell me something important about Brooklyn's history. Vanessa explained that what Brooklyn had done to me was not a one-time lapse in judgment but part of a pattern she had observed over years of friendship. In college, Brooklyn had targeted a friend's boyfriend by first befriending the girlfriend, gaining her trust and learning intimate details about their relationship. Then Brooklyn had systematically undermined that relationship while positioning herself as the supportive friend who truly understood what the boyfriend needed. The manipulation had been so subtle that by the time the girlfriend realized what was happening, her boyfriend had already left her for Brooklyn. That relationship lasted exactly 3 months before Brooklyn grew bored and moved on to someone else, leaving destruction in her wake with no apparent remorse. Vanessa said she had ended their friendship over that incident, disgusted by Brooklyn's calculated cruelty and her complete inability to take responsibility for the harm she caused. But she had watched from a distance as Brooklyn repeated variations of this pattern over the following years, always targeting men in established relationships, always framing herself as offering something their current partner could not provide, always presenting her interference as somehow noble or compassionate rather than predatory. I listened to Vanessa's account with growing recognition of how perfectly it described what Brooklyn had done to me. The dinner invitation that Miles had presented as mature and confident had actually been Brooklyn's opening move, her way of assessing the vulnerabilities in our marriage that she could later exploit. Her proposition about giving Miles a baby had not been spontaneous cruelty but calculated strategy, designed to position herself as the solution to problems she had helped create by encouraging Miles's dissatisfaction with our childless life. Vanessa offered to provide a written statement about Brooklyn's pattern of behavior, or even to testify in person if it would help my case. I immediately connected her with Patricia, knowing that having a witness who could speak to Brooklyn's history would devastate any argument that her dinner proposition had been innocent or well-intentioned. This was not misunderstood generosity. This was practiced manipulation by someone who had refined her technique over years of targeting vulnerable relationships. The night before the hearing, sleep was impossible. I walked through my house at 3 a.m, unable to quiet my mind enough for sleep. The hearing was scheduled for 9, just 6 hours away, and my thoughts kept circling through everything that could go wrong, every possible way Miles's attorney might twist the narrative or make me look unreasonable. I touched the walls as I moved through rooms that held 14 years of memories, some beautiful and some painful, all of them now belonging to a version of my life that was ending whether I was ready or not. I stood in the kitchen where Brooklyn had delivered her proposition and tried to remember exactly how I had felt in that moment, tried to hold on to the clarity of rage and betrayal that had driven every decision since. I needed that clarity tomorrow when I faced Miles across a courtroom, when his attorney tried to make me doubt my own perceptions and reactions. I made tea I did not drink and watched the sky gradually lighten through the window, and by the time my alarm went off at 6 I had been awake so long that the sound felt almost irrelevant. I dressed in the same navy suit I had worn to Patricia's office, armor that made me look calm and professional even though my hands shook while fastening the buttons. I arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early and sat in my car rehearsing the testimony I had practiced with Dr. Winters, reminding myself to breathe steadily and maintain composure no matter what questions were asked or what versions of reality were presented. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces I had seen in television shows and movies. There was no jury box, no grand judge's bench, just a practical hearing room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly washed out and institutional. Miles was already there when Patricia and I entered, sitting on the opposite side with his attorney, a man named Richard Brennan who had a reputation for aggressive tactics in family law cases. Miles looked terrible. His suit was wrinkled, his face haggard with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had slept as poorly as I had. When our eyes met across the room, he looked away quickly, and I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness at seeing him reduced to this state. Part of me had loved this man for 14 years. That part still existed somewhere inside me, mourning the loss even as the rest of me remained focused on winning the battle he had forced us into. Judge Morrison entered and we all stood, the formality of the gesture feeling oddly theatrical given the intimate nature of what we were about to discuss. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and an expression that suggested she had presided over countless variations of marital dysfunction and was thoroughly unimpressed by most of it. She reviewed the petitions silently for several minutes while we waited, the only sound in the room the quiet rustle of papers and the hum of the ventilation system. Patricia presented our case first, building the narrative methodically from Miles and Brooklyn's initial reconnection through the dinner that had ended our marriage. She submitted the text messages between them as evidence, reading selected excerpts aloud that made the emotional affair undeniable. I watched Miles's face go progressively whiter as his private conversations were exposed in legal proceedings, his carefully constructed version of innocent friendship collapsing under the weight of his own written words. When Patricia called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my prepared narrative clear in my mind. I described the dinner in careful detail, explaining how Brooklyn had delivered her proposition with calculated cruelty, how Miles had failed to defend me or shut down the grotesque offer immediately. I spoke about my medical history with endometriosis, about the treatments and surgeries and the grief we had supposedly shared over our childlessness. I explained how devastating it had been to learn that Miles had been discussing this private pain with Brooklyn, using it as justification for pursuing a relationship with her behind my back. My voice remained steady throughout the testimony, and I saw Judge Morrison's expression shift from neutral assessment to something that looked like sympathy as I described what had happened at that table. When Patricia asked how I had responded to Brooklyn's proposition, I explained that I had told Miles to follow his heart, that I had chosen calm over confrontation because losing control would have given them exactly the reaction they wanted. The judge made a note on her pad, and I knew that detail had landed the way Patricia intended, demonstrating that my composure had been strategic rather than indicative of acceptance. Miles's attorney cross-examined me with questions designed to paint me as vindictive and overreactive, but Patricia had prepared me well for each line of attack. When Brennan suggested I had misinterpreted Brooklyn's offer as malicious when it was actually compassionate, I calmly pointed out that offering to bear another woman's husband's child was not compassion by any reasonable definition. When he implied I was using the restraining order as a tactical weapon in divorce proceedings, I explained that a woman who had just been humiliated about her infertility in her own home had every right to protect herself from further contact with the people who had inflicted that harm. Then Miles took the stand and I watched his attorney attempt to salvage a narrative that was already falling apart. Miles testified that Brooklyn's offer had been inappropriate but not malicious, that he had been shocked into silence rather than complicit in my humiliation. He claimed the text messages were taken out of context, that he had been venting frustrations to an old friend but never seriously considered leaving me for her. His voice carried a note of injured innocence that might have been convincing if not for the documented evidence contradicting nearly everything he said. Judge Morrison asked him directly why he had not immediately shut down Brooklyn's proposition at dinner. Miles stumbled through an answer about being caught off guard and not wanting to make a scene, his explanation sounding weak even to my ears. The judge then asked why he had been meeting Brooklyn secretly for months if their friendship was as innocent as he claimed. Miles said he had not thought of it as secret, just private, because he knew I was uncomfortable with his past relationships. The contradiction was obvious. If the friendship was innocent, why would my discomfort require privacy rather than transparency? His testimony deteriorated further under continued questioning, contradictions piling up as he tried to maintain an appearance of innocence while the evidence showed clear patterns of emotional affair behavior. I watched him struggle and felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction or vindication but a hollow sense of waste. This man I had spent 14 years with was willing to lie under oath rather than take responsibility for his choices, and that reality felt worse than the betrayal itself. During a recess, while Patricia was reviewing notes and Miles was conferring with his attorney in hushed, urgent tones, Brooklyn made the catastrophic mistake of showing up. I saw her enter the gallery through the courtroom doors, wearing a dress that looked deliberately provocative for a legal proceeding and an expression of defiant righteousness that suggested she believed she was the hero rather than the villain in this story. Court resumed and we were midway through additional testimony when Brooklyn apparently could not contain herself any longer. She stood up in the gallery and started shouting about how I was punishing Miles for wanting a family, how I was weaponizing my infertility to play the victim, how she had only been trying to help us find a solution to our problems. Her voice rose with each accusation, her face flushed with indignation that suggested she genuinely believed her own narrative. Judge Morrison's gavel came down with a crack that silenced the courtroom instantly. Judge Morrison's voice cut through Brooklyn's tirade with the authority of someone who had spent decades managing courtroom disruptions and had exhausted all patience for dramatic outbursts. She told Brooklyn in language that left no room for interpretation that this hearing was not about family planning or reproductive rights or any of the other justifications Brooklyn was attempting to construct. This was about respect and cruelty and a man who had allowed his wife to be publicly humiliated in her own home by someone he had been conducting an emotional affair with for months. Brooklyn's face transformed from indignant righteousness to shock as Judge Morrison continued speaking. The judge extended the restraining order to include Brooklyn herself, prohibiting her from contacting either me or Miles for a minimum of 6 months. Brooklyn started to protest, and 2 bailiffs moved toward her position in the gallery with expressions that suggested they would not tolerate further disruption. She was escorted from the courtroom still trying to explain herself, her voice fading as the doors closed behind her. I watched Miles close his eyes as Brooklyn was removed, and in that gesture I saw the full weight of his mistake finally landing. His ex-girlfriend's catastrophic lack of self-awareness had just destroyed any remaining sympathy a judge might have had for his position. Patricia caught my eye and gave the smallest smile, a brief acknowledgement that we had just witnessed the opposition demolish their own case more effectively than any argument we could have made. Judge Morrison took a brief recess to review the evidence one final time before rendering her decision. I sat in the hallway with Patricia, neither of us speaking, both understanding that the outcome was no longer in doubt. 20 minutes later we were called back into the courtroom and Judge Morrison delivered her ruling with efficiency that suggested she saw no reason to prolong proceedings when the evidence was this clear. She extended the restraining order for 6 months. She granted me exclusive use of the marital home based on documentation proving it had been purchased primarily with my inheritance and improved with my earnings. She said a preliminary asset division that favored me heavily, acknowledging my financial contributions and the pattern of deception Miles had engaged in while building his relationship with Brooklyn. From the bench, she stated that while emotional affairs were not legally equivalent to physical adultery in our state, the evidence showed a sustained pattern of deception and disrespect that had created an emotionally unsafe environment justifying the protective order. Judge Morrison noted specifically that my decision to respond calmly at the dinner rather than with violence or emotional collapse demonstrated restraint rather than acceptance. She said my subsequent legal actions were appropriate self-protection rather than vindictive overreaction, a characterization that validated everything I had been trying to articulate since that Friday night. Miles's attorney attempted to object, but the judge cut him off, saying the evidence spoke with sufficient clarity that she had no interest in relitigating basic standards of human decency in marriage. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt physically lighter, as if some weight I had been carrying for months had finally been lifted from my shoulders. Not because I had won in some petty competitive sense, but because a neutral third party had examined all the evidence and confirmed that I was not crazy or oversensitive or vindictive. I had been genuinely betrayed, I had responded appropriately, and the legal system recognized that fundamental truth. The months that followed were consumed by settlement negotiations that Miles's attorney kept trying to reopen despite having no leverage to justify better terms. Patricia had built an airtight case, and every piece of evidence we had submitted was documented and independently verifiable. Miles made several attempts to reach me through intermediaries, sending messages through mutual friends and family members, writing letters that arrived at Patricia's office expressing regret and asking for opportunities to explain himself. The letters all followed similar patterns. Miles claimed he had never intended to hurt me, that Brooklyn had manipulated him into believing their connection was something more significant than it actually was, that he realized now he had made catastrophic mistakes in judgment. But the text messages we had submitted as evidence told a different story. His conversations with Brooklyn had started months before the dinner and had progressed systematically from nostalgic reminiscence to romantic interest to explicit planning of a future together. Whether he had ultimately intended to act on those plans or not became irrelevant once he had failed to defend me when Brooklyn weaponized our private pain and public humiliation. The final settlement came 4 months after the initial filing. I retained the house, the majority of our joint assets based on documented proof of my financial contributions, and something far more valuable than any material possession. I kept my dignity and my sense of self intact, refusing to be diminished by betrayal or defeated by the process of extracting myself from a marriage that had become toxic. Miles left with his personal belongings, his mounting regrets and reputation damage that followed him through our shared professional and social circles in ways that probably cost him more than any financial settlement. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Miles and Brooklyn attempted to pursue the relationship they had been planning during those months of secret meetings and text message exchanges. The reality of their connection apparently could not sustain the fantasy they had built while it remained forbidden and hypothetical. Their relationship lasted approximately 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized before collapsing under the weight of actual compatibility issues and unmet expectations, proving that what they had shared was infatuation rather than the profound connection Brooklyn had positioned it as during her dinner table proposition. In the aftermath of the divorce, I focused energy on rebuilding relationships that had atrophied during my marriage's slow deterioration. Carmen and I spent time together in ways we had not managed since before my wedding, and she told me honestly that she had watched me shrink over the years with Miles. I had become progressively quieter and more accommodating, losing parts of my personality and interest to maintain peace in a relationship that was never actually peaceful, just increasingly silent as we stopped communicating about anything that mattered. My college friend Rachel organized a dinner with our old friend group, women I had gradually drifted away from as I poured more energy into my marriage and less into friendships that had once been central to my identity. They welcomed me back without judgment or extensive questions about what had happened, accepting my return to their circle as natural rather than treating me like someone damaged who needed careful handling. We talked about the divorce but also about careers and travel plans and creative projects, and I realized how much I had isolated myself by making my marriage the central organizing principle of my entire life. My relationship with Miles's family remained complicated in ways I chose not to resolve. Diane sent a card several months after the divorce was finalized, apologizing for her initial reaction and expressing hope that I might eventually forgive Miles even if reconciliation was impossible. I wrote back thanking her for the apology but explaining clearly that forgiveness on my part did not create any obligation for ongoing contact. I wished Miles well in rebuilding his life but had no interest in maintaining relationships with his family members going forward. Brooklyn's public narrative unraveled spectacularly in ways I observed from a distance without direct involvement. Vanessa's testimony about Brooklyn's historical pattern of targeting men in established relationships had been submitted as part of our court proceedings, and somehow excerpts from that testimony began circulating through our extended social network. People who had initially felt sympathetic toward Brooklyn's social media posts about following your heart and authentic connections started questioning whether she had deliberately orchestrated the destruction of my marriage rather than stumbling into an unfortunate situation. Several mutual acquaintances reached out to tell me they had distanced themselves from Brooklyn after learning the full context of what had happened at that dinner. Brooklyn posted a lengthy defensive explanation claiming she had only been trying to help Miles access the family life he deserved. But the comments section turned hostile as people pointed out that offering to bear another woman's husband's child represented sabotage rather than assistance. She eventually deleted all her social media accounts after someone created a detailed thread documenting her history of pursuing unavailable men, and I heard she had moved to a different city to escape the social consequences of her choices. I felt no particular satisfaction in witnessing Brooklyn's social destruction. Only a grim acknowledgement that actions eventually generate consequences, and she was finally experiencing the natural results of behavior she had apparently engaged in for years without facing meaningful accountability. Now I sit in my house, truly and completely mine in every sense that matters, and the silence that fills these rooms feels peaceful rather than lonely. I have redecorated slowly and deliberately, replacing furniture that carried too many memories of Miles, painting walls in colors I chose without compromise or consideration of anyone else's preferences. The bedroom where I once cried about infertility treatments has been transformed into a personal sanctuary decorated in shades that soothe rather than remind. The dining room where Brooklyn delivered her poisonous proposition has been completely reimagined. New table, reupholstered chairs, different lighting that changes the entire atmosphere of the space. I have reclaimed it from that memory, and now I host dinner parties that feel joyful rather than performative, meals where laughter comes easily and conversation flows naturally among people who genuinely care about each other. Sometimes I think about that dinner party with something approaching gratitude, as strange as that sounds. Brooklyn thought she was offering Miles something I could not provide, but what she actually gave me was perfect clarity about exactly who I had married and what he was willing to tolerate. Miles thought my calm response meant acceptance and permission, but it was actually a declaration of war he failed to recognize until he had already lost everything that mattered. The sweetest element of my victory was not the financial settlement or retaining the house, though both brought satisfaction. It was watching Miles realize too late that he had traded 14 years of genuine partnership with someone who loved him for a fantasy that collapsed immediately upon contact with reality. I learned that following your heart remains excellent advice, but only when your heart maintains connection to a functioning brain. Miles followed his heart straight into disaster. I followed mine to freedom, but only after ensuring it was thinking clearly about consequences and long-term implications. That distinction transformed me from potential victim into someone who emerged from betrayal stronger and more certain about what I deserve and will accept in relationships going forward. If this story of strategic justice and reclaimed power had you gripping your seat, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Lila calmly told Miles to follow his heart at that dinner table, knowing she had already declared war. What was your favorite moment in this revenge story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Craving more stories of betrayal, revenge, and sweet justice? Subscribe and smash that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. 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 Story like this one.